Welcome to 6 African Trade Talks, the show that brings you closer to the intra-Africa trade business world. I'm your host, Chad Chawanda. In this episode, our guest is Kevin Nolan. Kevin is a partner at DLA Piper LLP. Kevin, welcome to 6 African Trade Talks. How are you?
Thank you. I am doing well. How are things going with you?
Very well, thank you. Before we start, we'd like to hear a word from our partners.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can. With Optimum African Experience, Cape Town Leisure Experience, with partners such as University of Cape Town, CEDA, Kadena, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
Tell us a little bit more about your organization and your professional journey.
Sure. So my firm is DLA Piper. We are a global law firm. So we have around 4,000 lawyers across the globe, and we deal with all different types of issues for different businesses and also litigation for different participants. I have been a lawyer for almost 15 years. I've been with DLA Piper for 5 years of that. And my practice specifically deals with assisting institutional investors invest in the private markets. So if you think about investing in venture capital funds, private equity funds, infrastructure funds, real estate funds, all those different asset classes, we help institutions such as pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, family offices, all those types of investors kind of make those investments. And that's across geographies, so in North America, and of course, for our purposes, in Africa as well. So there's a little bit about my organization. Specifically, DLA Piper Africa has 20 offices/alliances all across the continent. So we have probably the broadest reach of any global law firm on the continent. So it gives us a really good platform to be able to service clients and also have a breadth of being able to see the different kind of legal things that are happening across the continent.
Wow, 20 offices across the continent. That's covering almost half of the continent, which is pretty good. Tell us a little bit more about the role of a legal entity in fundraising.
Well, when you're thinking about kind of raising capital, especially in kind of the private market context, kind of the role of a legal entity can be really important to attract institutions to your fundraising process. So for example, if you're looking to get capital from Europe or from America, they're looking at certain jurisdictions that they're typically used to seeing when they're making investments. Those would be traditionally like a Delaware partnership. Recently, it's been a Luxembourg entity because Luxembourg has become more of a jurisdiction for European investors, especially since the UK have left the European Union. So those two jurisdictions you see a lot. Cayman Islands is still still a jurisdiction you would see a lot. And then Mauritius, when you're talking about the continent, is an entity that you will see utilized a lot because of the treaties that Mauritius has a lot of different jurisdictions on the continent. That makes it a lot easier to access a lot of jurisdictions. So when people are thinking about how to kind of access Africa through that type of asset class, typically it's one of those jurisdictions. Now you might have here and there different jurisdictions that utilize, but overall, overwhelmingly, you see around 4 jurisdictions. When it comes to the actual portfolio company itself, that can be a local jurisdiction. For example, we have someone I'm dealing with that has a Sudanese company and they are formed in Sudan. So that access of that would be through the private equity fund or the venture capital fund, and they would then fund it into that Sudanese company. So you can still use your local jurisdiction for a portfolio company. But if you're trying to raise capital from an institutional investor into a fund, typically you're thinking about 3 or 4 different types of jurisdictions that would normally be utilized.
Interesting. You spoke about jurisdictions such as Mauritius, Cayman Islands, and the likes. There is Rwanda as well that has come up. Have you dealt with Rwanda? I know Rwanda is coming up with the Kigali International Financial Center, which is already in operation. Any interaction there?
Yeah, well, I haven't had any personally, but I have a partner in Mauritius, and I was actually talking to him about this a week or so ago. And he said that, Rwanda does have a good framework that it's setting up. I think he still thinks that there is some time and process that's still needed as far as to kind of get everything really set up where it's a reliable jurisdiction that people will overwhelmingly go back and forth to. But he does say that it has a foundation that's being laid there, and he does think in a few years that would be something of a reliable jurisdiction. At this point, he thinks it's still early on in that stage. So I think we're all kind of hoping and have a lot of promise in how things are being set up. But at this point, I don't think there's enough comfort in that jurisdiction yet to attract a large amount of kind of outside capital.
Certainly. And I also think that, just like the story of Rwanda, it has really come out as a positive story. So we look forward to the positive Kigali International Financial Center as well. So quite optimistic. Any impact of technology, seeing though that, you operate in these different jurisdictions in Africa, what has been the impact of technology for you guys?
I think it's been amazing because it allows you to interact with people on a more fluid basis than before, right? With your ability to have these different interactions through Zoom, through different media like that, I think the access of that makes it easier for there to be a lot of conversation, a lot of movement, and a lot of ways for, providers, for investors, for people on the ground to be able to interact, between your WhatsApp, your Zooms, and all those different things. I think that kind of makes things a lot more fluid. Also, the pandemic had, of course, a lot of devastating outcomes. But one of the things that came from that was the acceptance more often of electronic signatures. So a lot more jurisdictions allow electronic signatures due to the fact that people couldn't be meeting in person to do a lot of the signing. I think that part of technology was also really helpful. And then secondarily, a lot of diligence used to have to be done kind of in person. Usually investors wouldn't trust to do a virtual diligence process. But with the pandemic, a lot of diligence had to be done virtually. And I think now there's a lot more comfort in being able to do things kind of virtually. And that's cut down a lot of the expense that it would take to get to the continent for some investors to be able to kind of look at things and kind of really dig deep and still have confidence in what they're doing with a virtual diligence process. So I think all those things combined have made it a lot less process for people to kind of really look into their different investments or potential investments in Africa.
Certainly. And, Africa being such a huge continent, the cost of travel as well. I can imagine what it would have been running 20 offices and you have to travel, or you have teams traveling all over the continent with the cost of traveling in Africa. So interesting. That takes us anyway to traveling. Have you traveled across the continent? Any lessons that you'd like to share from your travels?
I haven't really gotten a chance to travel there. I am actually going to be in Africa next week for the Africa Private Equity Venture Capital Association annual conference. That's taking place in Cairo. So I'm looking forward to that trip. I was scheduled to travel to Senegal last year for that same conference, but unfortunately came down with something that wasn't able to travel. But haven't really had too much experience with traveling myself individually. I've dealt with a lot of my partners who have traveled to the continent and trying to figure out the different schedules. I think one of the things that makes it a little more difficult for me personally is I'm in Austin, Texas. So that travel from here to Africa can be more of a demanding travel agenda. But I think the plan this year is I'll be in Cairo next week. As I mentioned, I'm supposed to be in Botswana for, I think, the US Africa Business Summit in July. And then I'm going to end the year in Cape Town for the Super Return Africa Conference. I think the plan will be to be in Africa at least 3 times a year going forward. So that's the plan as far as kind of my future travels to the continent.
So what's quite interesting is that you've already have had impact on the continent, but you haven't really traveled on the continents, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And already in a year, you're looking at traveling to quite a number of places. So that also is quite interesting. Before we continue, we'd like to hear word from our partners. IATF is an initiative that supports the implementation of the AFCFTA. It is organized by Afrexim Bank in collaboration with the African Union, the AFCFTA Secretariat, marking an important step to sustainably address the gap in trade and market information for the successful realization of the AFCFTA objectives. Ms. Kanayo Awani, the Executive Vice President of Intra-African Trade Bank, Afrexim Bank, said a lack of access to trade and market information is one of the key reasons for the low level of intra-African trade. We hope to see you at the next IATF. So Kevin, can you share with international investors or anyone in the diaspora about investing in a market like Africa? I know Africa has got 54 countries. What could you share based on your experience and interaction?
It's such a dynamic market now. I think if you look back 10 years ago or a little bit longer, I think for the most part, you would see a lot of infrastructure was being done, and those were being done by the DFIs. And that was probably the majority of the private investment in Africa. I think today you see a lot more kind of varied investment diaspora. So what you would see is now there's a lot more kind of private equity, middle market investments. You still have infrastructure, and now you have a lot more venture capital investment that's happening. So I think with all those three things, I think now you have a lot of different options of what you're looking at as far as asset classes are concerned on the continent. There's also a little bit more of a track record of people investing, a lot more other institutional investors, because a lot of times institutional investors are looking to see if other institutions are investing in these different places, and that gives them some comfort. I think that has become a lot easier to see because there are a lot more institutions that are investing on the continent, and I think that gives the other investors some comfort. So between that happening and the variation in the different asset classes, I think it gives people the opportunity to kind of really look at the continent and really kind of pick and choose what they would like to be in, as opposed to, 10 to 15 years ago, there was really, one or two things we were focused on kind of investing in private markets in Africa. I think that's just going to continue to develop. I think everyone is aware of the Africa growth story. So everyone knows that Africa will be the place where most of the growth will take place in the next 50 years. I think the issue has always been like, how do you capture that kind of growth, and what's the best place to invest to make sure you harness the returns and the performance of that. And I think it's becoming a little more clear about how you can do that more recently and with the varied types of investment fields that you can get into.
Certainly, the future of Africa looks quite interesting. We're very optimistic. And, it takes us to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Being from the US and having exposure to EU, Britain has broken away from the EU. And here we are in Africa, we are talking about coming up with one market. How's your view like?
I think it's going to be so powerful. I think that having this free trade kind of compact between all the different African countries is going to make the movement of goods and commerce and all of that a lot simpler. I think having kind of varying tariffs and taxes really did hinder trade in a way that is not beneficial when you need an entire block to somehow be able to be a force when it comes to trading, right? So I think it is going to be something that is very helpful. I saw some of the projections this morning again about how many people that this is expected to lift out of poverty. And I think it will, because I think the back and forth of the trade will just make it that there will be a lot more goods that are traded more freely. And once you have more trade, and I think hopefully that will generate a lot more income for people that are trading, and then that will create more jobs and opportunities for people that are supporting the trade. So I think at the end of the day, this should be very beneficial. It's also very interesting that they had different tiers in the free trade agreement, because it seems like if you're at a certain stage of development, then different things kick in. So I think that that was a very thoughtful way of doing it. It wasn't just a blanket free trade. It was kind of depending on where your country was in its development is how the access would occur. So I think it being thoughtful, but also trying to make sure that we are kind of knocking down any kind of barriers there are to making sure that all the countries in Africa are given an opportunity to kind of develop and increase their trading opportunities. I think it'll be something that will be very beneficial. I think it's just been effective as of 2021. So, that's a tough start time because that's right in the middle of the pandemic. So I think we'll need to give it a few more years to see how the real benefits kind of come through since it really went into effect during the pandemic.
That's true. And it was actually supposed to start in 2020 and they moved it to 2021 January. And, the 1st of January was the first day. So still a long way. I just attended the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum last week in Cape Town. And it was quite interesting to see the support and the number of people that are really, pushing to make it a reality, and just the milestones, the things that have been achieved in such a short space of time, which we'll share in a later episode. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic as you are. From a legal perspective, what can you share with an entrepreneur in Africa who's looking at fundraising, or how can they structure their business for funding from outside Africa, based on your experience?
Yeah, I think, the best thing you can do is try to have, all your structures, in as good an order as you possibly can. And I know that can be difficult depending on what jurisdiction you're in. But typically, if an investor is going to come directly into a company, they just want to make sure, their books and records are clean, right? Their formation, they have the formation documents clean. If they have any, employment contracts, those are all kind of signed and done. And just having kind of your books and records in order, I think that sends a good sign to the investor that this particular entrepreneur really has his ducks in a row as far as having everything organized in that type of fashion. Because then when you're moving on to kind of getting investment, the investor's not worried about those types of things. They're now thinking about valuations, they're thinking about the metrics of the revenue, the projections, and things like that. So the less you can have an investor worry about some of those back office items, and the more they can just focus on your metrics and your product, I think that kind of makes it an easier diligence process for the investor and makes it more compelling for them to kind of think about how to move forward. It also helps them be more thoughtful about what ways they can help with the product or the metrics or the sales, and not be as worried about some of those other back office items. And it also gives them a lot more confidence to say, I know that this person has really kind of put in all the work it takes to keep a company or an organization running as efficiently as possible already. So I'm not already concerned about there might be things falling through the cracks because they can't even have some of their things that we would think are standard kind of set up in an organized fashion.
Interesting to look at. And, I've seen quite a number of entrepreneurs ignoring the structure perspective. And sadly, that's where most of them lose the opportunity of getting funding because they try and fix it when it's too late. So thank you very much for sharing. Any book or podcast you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
As far as books are concerned, the one book I was reading now, and my group had given it out to the partners here. It was called Overcoming the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It was written by Patrick Lencioni. And it was just really about, if you're trying to create a powerful team, which I think at the end of the day, we all are trying to do in some shape or fashion, it just talked about the different things that you need to focus on just to make your team work as well as possible, and the 5 things that you typically see that go wrong with teams where they don't function as well as they could. So there's that book. And another book that we have here is called It Starts with Clients. That book is by Andrew Sobel. I'm just reading that book. And it just talks about kind of thinking like a client thinks and what's important to them, what issues would you typically think that a client would want to see resolved, and then how do you approach that, and what's the efficient and best way to partner with the client and trying to achieve their goals. So those are the 2 books I'm reading now. As far as podcasts are concerned, I just listen to a lot of the just entertainment podcasts. The one business podcast, or I should say current event podcast I listen to is the New York Times has the daily podcast that comes out. They do a 30-minute kind of current issue, and I'll listen to that in the morning. But that's probably the only like news/business podcast I listen to on a regular basis.
Would you travel to Cape Town for business or leisure? What if you could combine the two? Well, you can. With Optimum African Experience, Cape Town Leisure Experience, with partners such as the University of Cape Town, CEDA, Medina, Luminary, and Prime Focus. Experience the best of Africa.
Africa is a continent full of potential, but potential means nothing if we don't take action to create value. Let us take action. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to post and share this episode on your social media platforms. It will help us reach our mission of sharing knowledge about intra-Africa trade and making it available to as many people as possible. Let us grow our continent. We can go far, fast, together. If you can please leave a review on our podcast page or on Apple Podcasts.